It's hard to believe that the Nintendo Switch is exactly 5 years old to the day. Where in the hell does the time go? But what might be even harder to believe is that it could have another 5 years or more left in the tank. That is, at least, if Nintendo is to be believed, as they've insisted at every opportunity, including as recently as just 2 weeks ago, that the Nintendo Switch is only at the midpoint of its cycle. Now look, Nintendo has said a lot of things over the years, not all of which has been true. Remember when they denied the existence of the DS Lite literally the day before it was announced? Good times! But in this case, not only is there good reason to believe that they're actually telling the truth, but also that the next phase of the Switch's lifespan could possibly be better than the first 5 years. But first, let's explore Nintendo's claim a bit more, starting with why it might seem to be so unbelievable at first glance. And that's probably because Nintendo has historically replaced every console to date on a roughly 5-year cycle. Or even less for the poor Wii U. Sorry Wii U, you are too pure for this cruel, cruel world. And yet, as we enter the Switch's 6th year, not only has Nintendo failed to announce a successor to the Switch, but they've seemingly doubled down on it. Because the remainder of 2022 is jam-packed with major releases, which is far more impressive than the 6th year of almost every other Nintendo platform. Furthermore, Nintendo is just committed to nearly 2 years of DLC for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, a game that is almost 5 years old by itself. Whoa! None of this is what you would expect to see from a console on its last legs. And there's a very good reason for this. The Nintendo Switch just won't stop selling. During its 5th year on the market, it sold more than any previous year, which is especially ridiculous considering that nearly every other Nintendo console to date would be on its deathbed by this point, if not already buried. Again, sorry Wii U. By comparison, Nintendo's previously best-selling console, being the Wii, peaked in its 3rd year, and steadily declined every year from there before finally being replaced by the Wii U at the end of 2012. Whereas with the Switch, we don't even know if it's reached its peak yet. Especially when we consider that Nintendo's president has cautioned that they may not even be able to meet demand for this next year thanks to chip shortages that are plaguing the entire industry. Which isn't exactly the worst problem to have for a platform entering its 6th year. But here's the thing, this isn't entirely without precedent for Nintendo. Because let's not forget that the Switch is really only half console, as it's also half portable. And when it comes to the portable space, Nintendo's been even more successful, as the Nintendo DS, which is Nintendo's most successful system ever, didn't peak until its 5th year. But there's an even more impressive example, being the original Game Boy, which seemed to hit its peak 6 years in. Except, it later hit a second, even bigger peak in years 11 and 12, largely thanks to a little series you may have heard of, called Pokémon. Yeah, who would have guessed that would become so big? And having a sales peak that late in a system's life is just insane. Now, this isn't to say that the Nintendo Switch is going to repeat either or even both of those accomplishments. I'm just pointing out that having a single Nintendo platform that lasts for over a decade isn't unheard of. Once again, we're already halfway there, and there's no endpoint in sight. So with the Switch still breaking records, having just recently outsold the Wii, we have to ask, what exactly is the incentive for Nintendo to replace the Switch? Especially when it has no real competition in the hybrid space. The closest competitor it has at this point only launched a few days ago, being the Steam Deck, and even it seems to be targeting an overall different demographic. The bottom line is that rolling over to an entirely new generation is always a risk, as Nintendo proved for 3 console generations straight, with each new system selling less than the previous one. At the end of the day, there's simply no guarantee that the people who bought the previous system will buy into the next one anytime soon, if even at all. Which not only closes off a massive user base and revenue stream in this case, but also potentially loses some of them as customers forever. So why bother with that if there's no real competitive pressure? Especially since, even 5 years later, the Nintendo Switch is still a novel little device that can punch impressively above its graphical weight class, at least when in the right hands. Now, all that being said, Nintendo is undoubtedly working on a Switch successor of sorts. Nintendo's even said as much themselves, and a super recent leak from Nvidia seems to back that up, as it suggests that they're working on a system potentially capable of 4K visuals by way of DLSS, which is Nvidia's incredibly impressive AI-powered upscaling technique. And even that's kind of underselling it. But there's still no news as to the timing of when the supposed successor could actually release. But again, with Nintendo committing to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe until the end of 2023, it seems unlikely that it would launch before then. But even if Nintendo did launch a successor before that point, it's still entirely possible for it to exist while also staying true to their word of the Switch only being middle-aged. And we only have to look to Nintendo's own history to see how. Because do you remember those Game Boy numbers we talked about earlier? Well, those weren't bolstered by just Pokemon, but also the release of the Game Boy Color, which Nintendo considers to be part of the original Game Boy line. And for good reason, it kind of was. Now sure, it had a color display and was more powerful, and it even had some exclusive games too. But it also supported the Game Boy's entire library of games up to that point, encompassing hundreds of them. And even most of the new games beyond that point worked on both systems, offering enhancements on the Game Boy Color while also being backwards compatible with the original Game Boy. It was the best of both worlds, and Nintendo basically did it again with the DSi. And we firmly believe that's the most likely path Nintendo would take with a Switch successor, largely because it doesn't sacrifice their existing 100 million plus user base on Nintendo Switch, by not only supporting every Nintendo Switch game to date, but also allowing for new ones that can work across both models, with enhancements like 4K upscaling reserved for the newer one. And then, as with the Game Boy Color, Nintendo can eventually and gradually introduce exclusives for the newer hardware that simply wouldn't be able to run on the prior model. It would allow for a much smoother generational transition, being spread out over years instead of being an abrupt halt to one and an awkward start to the other. And that's partially why the next 5 years of the Nintendo Switch could be the most exciting ones yet, because Nintendo's already kicking off the Switch's 6th year with a bang, as it features at least 13 first-party games still planned for release by the end of the year, one of which is literally launching tomorrow. And one of the others includes the likes of Splatoon 3, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, a Wii Sports sequel, and a first ever 3D Kirby? Well boy howdy, Nintendo's not holding back. And that's not even a touch on the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which isn't too far off on the horizon even if it does miss this year. And that's almost certainly not even all the releases planned for the year, as Nintendo always has a few more surprises in store. I mean, a brand new generation of Pokemon was just announced a few days ago, which is ridiculous considering we just got an entirely new take on the Pokemon formula a few weeks back. And let's not forget Metroid Prime 4, which isn't dated yet either, but is yet another likely long-term commitment to the existing platform. And that's not even to mention all of Nintendo's internal studios that have been flying under the radar for a few years now. What is the Mario Odyssey team up to anyway? Well, whatever it is, it's surely to be big. And it's almost certainly coming to Nintendo Switch when it does. And that's almost entirely just year 6. But as we mentioned, Nintendo's committed to Mario Kart DLC through the end of year 7 as well, which would help us usher in the Nintendo Switch's 8th year. Yeah, it says a lot about Nintendo's confidence in the sustainability of this aging platform. And that's not even to mention the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack that launched only a few months ago, which would make zero sense to launch on a platform that was entering its final years, especially if it couldn't be rolled over onto the next one. And that's exactly why a Switch successor that complements but doesn't immediately replace a Switch makes the most sense. It would foster an environment that Nintendo developers are already comfortable within, while allowing them to dip their toes in expanded hardware capabilities, without having to come to grips with an entire new ecosystem. Anyone who experienced the Wii U era surely remembers how rough the transition to HD was for Nintendo and their fans. Yeah, who didn't love having a brand new 2D Mario that looked almost exactly like the last 3 of them? This method would allow for the Switch's final years to end delightfully and gracefully, rather than the sad whimper that most of Nintendo consoles generally end with. It could be supported for years during the transition until the newer system matures enough to stand on its own 2 legs, thereby giving the widest amount of people some of the best experiences for as long as possible. And it's in this way that both Nintendo and its fans would benefit greatly. So happy 5th birthday Nintendo Switch, and here's to another 5 more. And that wraps up for us here, but what do you all think of this? Do you think the Nintendo Switch can make it to a 10th birthday? Let us know by posting in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more on the Nintendo Switch, its eventual successor, and everything else Nintendo as well. With that, we'll catch you later. Bye everyone!